Right. Good afternoon, everybody. And we are ready to roll with a discussion of Sharadindu Bandopadhyay's story, Heyalir Chhanda in Bengali, which is translated into English as the rhythm of riddles. I will, of course, be using the translation made by Aruna Ghosh Sinha. And what we shall discuss today is the problematization of morality in the realm of detective fiction. Now, a few small details before I move on to uh, the the story proper. Hyali Chanda was, of course, a later Sharadindu story in the sense that it was written in 1963 and published in 1967, and it takes place in the aftermath, therefore, of the partition of the country, of the separation of India into Bangladesh and Pakistan, as it were, and therefore this entire scenario of uh, post-independence India becomes a very crucial part of uh, of this entire story. Now, you will of course also remember that in our discussion of Shottanneshi and the detective fiction of Byomkesh Bakshi, we in our earlier lecture, which you will find on YouTube, is we talked about how Sharadindu was essentially indigenizing the Bangla detective. One, two, we were talking about how the material city life of Kolkata during this entire period between the 1930s to the 1960s is shown in Sharadindu's fiction, and how the role of the detective, and this is very important with the Byomkesh stories, how the role of the detective, the unfolding of the detective story, is also quintessentially associated with the unfolding of the story of the nation. So therefore the nation and the narration, as it were, move in tandem, and this is something we should see also with Heyalir Chhanda, or the rhythm of riddles. Now, just to give you a very brief idea of what happens in the story, uh, initially, as Ajit narrates, the Ajit is the narrator, the sidekick for Byomkesh, of course. Byomkesh is out on a government assignment for the country to Cuttack. Now, this role of Byomkesh is very interesting in the story, you see, because Byomkesh is seen frequently as acting on behalf of the government. Earlier, it was the colonial government, but now it has become the national government of India. Therefore, he's performing, as it were, a national duty. So, the role of the detective and the integration of the detective within the national movement is something that Sharadindu talks about. He is not including him as part of the nationalist struggle as such, but in post-independence India, Byomkesh definitely has a role to play in solving the cases of the government. Right. Therefore, there is a certain, let us say, nationalist agenda within Sharadindu's fiction, and if you read his other historical fictions, you will find Sharadindu recurrently refers to this essential nationalist agenda that some of the Byomkesh Bakshi stories have. There are frequent references to riots, for example. There is the reference in Rakte Dag to the moment of independence, where the criminal's earlier record is, as it were, erased, and a new start is made, both for Byomkesh and Probal, and as well as it were, for the entire, as it were, nation. So the stories, what I would like to emphasize, are directly enmeshed, as it were, within the nationalist discourse. Now, when we come to Heyalir Chhanda, or the rhythm of riddles, we find therefore that Byomkesh is off to Kotok and Ajit is left in a two-storied house, and they live upstairs. And on the first floor, you have a mess. And the mess is a figure that recurs in the Byomkesh Bakshi stories quite often. As you will remember, this mess is part of the urban Kolkata, part of the life of the clerks of Kolkata who pour into the city from the Mufasils and who live essentially bachelor lives and bond with each other. Now, interestingly, this is a very interesting formation in the sense that on the top floor, you have a family, the extended family of Byomkesh Bakshi with Shotyabati and Ajit. On the first floor, you actually have a mess where we will talk about three people. We'll talk about Bhupesh Babu, who is the agent, or is not the agent, who is an employee of a insurance company. And we have Ram Chandro and Bonomali, Ram Babu and Bonomali, who are essentially, working in a bank. Therefore, it's interesting in the sense that this is a part of a mess which constitutes of 6 rooms. The ground floor is taken up by the mess manager and a gentleman named Notobor Noshkor, who is going to be murdered and who is going to be shot. And his death is going to be the subject matter of the mystery. Now, interestingly also, Bhupesh Babu comes to meet Ajit with the idea that they want to play bridge. So they've got 3 people, they want a partner, the 4th partner, so that it completes a quadruplet of people who will play bridge. Again, this association of card games, especially bridge, is part of contemporary Bengali culture. If you ask your grandfathers or even your parents, maybe some of them have indeed played bridge. Cards were an essential part of the afternoon retinue or the evening retinue of the bachelor, people working in Kolkata. And secondly, again, this card game of bridge is a game of intelligence. Therefore, in many ways, the grafting of the bridge game onto the detective story is also a highlight of the cerebral nature of the Bengali middle class milieu. Now, when Ajit talks about Bhupesh Babu, he talks about a middle-aged gentleman smiling deferentially. He says that I'm Bhupesh Chatterjee, I live on the first floor. And he suggests that he's just arrived in Calcutta from Dhaka, and he's a traveling employee of the insurance company. And all these people, the Rambabu and Ghanshyam Babu, for Bonomali Babu, for example, work in Godfrey Brown and Company. So these are companies, large companies, which employ many clerks, and the colonial hangover of the urban Bengali is still very prominent, right? So the point is that Ajit now joins them, and they gradually become good friends, and they observe, and very interestingly, he observes that both Rambabu and Bonomali, they look alike. So he puts the question, "Are you cousins?" And they're immediately extremely perturbed by the question, and they say, "No, we are." One is a Vaidya and the other is a Kayastha. They try to make this distinction. Of course, we'll later on find out that they're not only sort of related to each other, they're actually blood brothers, right? And they're concealing their own identity. Now, interestingly, as this game goes on, one afternoon, as Ajit enters the room to play cards, he finds that Bhupesh Babu is standing by the window and pointing out, there he goes, he says, as a man with a brown wrapper around him actually sort of appears to disappear in the next lane. And the 2 cousins actually sort of say that, yes, we have also seen them. And they hear a burst, which sort of could be like a cracker or going off, or a tire burst, or the sound of a gun firing. And they go to inquire downstairs with Notobor Noshkor's room, where they find that Notobor Noshkor is dead. he has been shot, and the pistol has been kept on the window sill. So this far, of course, you have the officer of the police station called Pranab, and we've seen how, the Pranab Daroga, as he's called, is inimical towards Byomkesh and Ajit, because Byomkesh habitually triumphs over the police system. This is also another very interesting part of the story. The fictional detective, we find, is almost always more smart, or smarter than the actual policeman. So the police and the detective share a kind of a relationship that is based both on competition, hatred, and dependence, as it were. Now, Pranab, of course, says that both Ajit and the mess manager should not leave the town because they have the brown wrappers. They use the brown aloan, as they say, around them. And it is at this point of time that Byomkesh comes back. Ajit has written his narrative, and Byomkesh comes back to town. Now, when Byomkesh comes back, you see, interestingly, Byomkesh immediately takes an interest in this case, primarily because it is right in his proximity, and the policeman has challenged him that that when Byomkesh comes back, he immediately challenges. The police have challenged that how could a murder take place in the detective's backyard. So he tries to solve the case. He goes to meet the two people who are obviously scared of him, the brothers, and they try to evade his questions. Bhupesh Babu, of course, is not perturbed. And Byomkesh actually goes to the site of the crime. He explores the room, and he goes to the lane where he will find a small, as it were, a small kind of a sort of, he calls it a pashute dag, a small mark made by the bursting of a cracker, actually. And he will immediately sort of sniff around to find what has caused this mark. Right. It is then that he sort of understands that, it's not actually a gun that has been fired from the window, but that something of a subterfuge has been made so that, people think that a person has fired the gun standing in that lane. Of course, the police have not sort of explored all this. He then goes to the police station because the chain of custody of the deceased person is left there, and he goes and sees the belongings of Notobod Noshkor, where he finds a diary where every month Notobod Noshkor is taking money from two gentlemen, Bon Bihari Babu and Ghanashyam Babu, and immediately he realizes that an element of blackmail was taking place by Notobod Noshkor. And then, of course, he inquires from the brothers where they work. They tell him about Godfrey Brown. He goes to the office of the Browns, and he discovers also about their identities. And then, very interestingly, all of these people actually have a background in what was erstwhile East Bengal, and is now a different country altogether. So all the three people, the two brothers, Bhupesh Babu, have all migrated from East Bengal to West Bengal post independence, right? And Byomkesh, of course, sort of finds also in Notobod Noshkor's belongings the decree or the formal judgment of the court, which indicts the two brothers in their earlier avatar for stealing money from a bank and from stealing money from a company. And then he comes back and understands what Notobod Noshkor's profession was as a blackmailer. It is here again that Byomkesh comes back and talks about the element of putra shok, of losing one's son. And Bhupesh Babu sort of brings a picture to him. It shows him a picture of his son who was taken away during the riots and never came back, and confesses that he's been trying to forget about the death of his son, and asks what is the medicine for this. And Byomkesh's only answer is that only time can heal these wounds. It's interesting in the sense that what you have in this particular story is Bengal's history, more importantly, Calcutta's history, as caught within a particular time period, of riots, partitions, division of the country, deaths, families taken apart. And then, of course, Byomkesh finds out about this entire plot. And in the final denouement, as it were, he calls the people together. The brothers are called out for their crime and earlier crime, and they promise that they will never violate the law again, at which point Byomkesh lets them go with a warning that if there is any embezzlement in their particular bank, then he will be forced to reveal the truth. This is point number one. Now, when they have gone, then Bhupesh Babu confesses that, he was always anticipating that Byomkesh would solve the crime. And he was hoping that because Byomkesh had gone away, he would not be here when the investigation took place. But now that he's here, Byomkesh asks him two questions. How did you conceal the sound made by the gun? And he shows the shawl through which he is shot Notober Nashkar, one. And secondly, the motive, where Bhupesh Babu says that Notober Nashkar was the man who took his son away from school and tried to blackmail him for 10,000 rupees. He had given all his belongings. His wife had given all her ornaments, but his son was never found and his wife had died. So the motive of Bhupesh Babu at that point of time is to take revenge against this treachery, this act of treachery against Notober Nashkar. Now, once this moment has passed and the crime has been explained, then comes the interesting part. And Bhupesh Babu asks, what now? What will you do with me? Now, as we've seen that here, the person who is murdered is actually a criminal in himself. Not only is he a criminal, but he's also the worst kind of a criminal, who is a blackmailer and who has ruined lives, in the sense that he's sort of kept a leash on the brothers. But more importantly, he has led to the death of a young child within riot-torn East Bengal. It is then that Byomkesh suggests that you are not to be hanged because you kill a crow or a vulture. So this categorization of the vulture, of Notober Nashkar as a vulture, and therefore Bhupesh Babu's act of vengeance, Byomkesh is willing to forgive. Now, herein lies the point at which I am interested in the story, not because it's of any other aspect of the story, but together with Rokte Dag, there is a problematization of the moral dimension of the detective tale. Now, in terms of law, the law says that vengeance must only belong to the law, that any violation of the law is a crime in itself. So for the law, murdering a criminal is equivalent to a criminal's act of murder, right? So you get me. The point is, for the law, there is no distinction between killing a criminal or killing a obnoxious person and killing any other individual. So in that sense, the law is morally blinded, as it were. But for Byomkesh here, the detective's interpretation of criminality and punishment is relative. He suggests that at any given point, it is circumstance and the morality of the person who is being killed that becomes the subject of his, as it were, of his judgment at that point of time. So the detective's interpretation of morality, that's the point I'm trying to make. The detective's interpretation of morality is much more problematic than the legal penal system. For the police, if they had caught Bhupesh Babu, he would have immediately been taken to jail and been punished by the law. But for Byomkesh, you see, at this point of time, he has to take into consideration who Notober Noshkor is and what the act of vengeance of Bhupesh Babu means. Now, interestingly, this you might immediately say is dubious in the sense that what if this is a Hindu and a Muslim problem, and therefore Byomkesh's interpretation of the law being an invitation for problematics. It's very interesting in the sense that nowhere in Byomkesh's stories do we actually see Hindu-Muslim riots taking place or crimes based on religious difference. Now, you will also have to understand that at this point of time, detective fiction, while it is talking about crime, it is carefully eliding over these religious differences so that there is no provocation of any further questions about religious difference. So Sharadindu's criminal within riot-torn East Bengal is a Hindu, Notober Noshkor, who takes Bhupesh Chattopadhyay's son away only and money away only, never to return. Right? Therefore, the worst possible kind of a criminal, killing whom is not an act of, is not to be punished subsequently according to Byomkesh. And he therefore says that the police will never be able to catch you because they are inefficient, and therefore I am letting you go. Now, this is the premise on which, you see, many of the detective fictions operate, and this is where the premise of the detective's law or the legal implications of detective fiction are segregated from the legal implications of the police and the judicial and the penal system. So the fictional detective, as it were, has this kind of poetic license, has this problematic attitude towards the law and the criminal, so that the detective story can then push into inquiring and problematizing the very basis of crime and punishment. What constitutes a crime? To kill a criminal, and a worst kind of a criminal, is it a crime? What if this is an act of vengeance? Which act of vengeance is justifiable? Right? Finally, what punishment? Is there a difference in punishment between the way you look at a sort of criminal and the way you look at the murder of another criminal? These are some of the problematic issues that Byomkesh raises. So my point, therefore, you see, in discussing the Byomkesh Bakshi stories is not merely that the Byomkesh Bakshi stories lead to the triumph of reason over chaos, or the law over law over crime. There are multiple layers and nuances which take place. See, the triumph of reason over chaos is something that the narration will go ahead with. But the what is the correct interpretation of the law, and where does crime end and justice begin, are issues that Byomkesh Bakshi questions in this particular story. So this is the Heyalir. This is the riddle. The riddle is the law itself and the interpretation of justice according to the human psychology. Also important to see is here the degree of, let us put it, latitude that the detective takes. And this is the degree of latitude of reconciliation within independent India. See, the moment of independence and partition is seen as a moment where human beings become beasts, and therefore to move over that, a degree of reconciliation is important, for which people like Nottobor Noshkar must be removed from the scenario. So, in that sense, therefore, there are questions of vengeance, there are questions of justice, there are questions of law which are problematized in this particular riddle that Byomkesh is weaving for himself, and which we are calling the Heyalir Chhanda, and therefore the rhythm of riddles. It is with this, therefore, that I would like to see how Sharadindu is bringing one contemporary history into detective fiction. So not only is he Bengalifying the detective, but also the urgent history of Bengal is becoming the subject and the scenario of the stories, and the paradoxes and the difficulties of interpreting history at this point of time by the human personality is becoming an integral part of detective fiction itself. So in that sense, Sharadindu was right when he said that he was not sure about whether he should call Byomkesh Bakshi stories detective fictions or social fictions, because the stories of Byomkesh Bakshi integrally bring them within themselves this aspect of the social realities of contemporary India. And that is what makes Byomkesh such a very urgent figure in a climactic moment in human history. Right? It is with this, therefore, that I would like to bring this lecture to a close. You see, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. But remember that I have deliberately chosen this text as one where these difficult issues of law, of vengeance, justice, and the problematization is made, where the detective and the author have the license, as it were, to determine, to judge, and therefore let go of, or move in a different direction than the mechanism of the law would have. Right? And that is why I chose the story for you. Of course, we've seen Shottanneshi, which is one of the introductory stories, and which gives us the idea of the Bengali detective. Right? So it is with this that we see how Sharadindu is playing around with genre of social fiction and detective fiction. The final idea of that crime will have to be punished is problematized here in terms of social fiction, where the nuances of society are explored. And secondly, of course, there is the problematization of the entire system of justice, law, and the penal system. Right. It is with this, therefore, since I see no question on the chat box, that I bring my discussion to a conclusion, and we will see to it, and we will consider that this segment of the syllabus is taught. Thank you very much for listening in, and if there are any further questions, do let me know and I can address them. Thank you.